I was folding Daniel's shirts when his wallet fell out of his pants pocket. It hit the laundry room floor with a soft thud, spilling a few cards and a folded piece of paper that fluttered to my feet. I thought it was a receipt from the gas station. I picked it up without thinking, smoothing the crease with my thumb. The handwriting stopped me cold. It was neat, feminine, and unmistakably familiar. Lydia's. My daughter-in-law's. The note was short, just one sentence, but it sliced through me like glass. "If you tell your mother the truth, it's over." I froze, the words echoing in my head. The hum of the dryer, the faint smell of detergent, even the light coming through the window, all of it vanished. What truth? Why would Lydia warn my son not to tell me something? And why did the tone feel like a threat, not a plea? For a few seconds I just stood there, gripping the paper so tightly it crumpled in my hand. I had no idea that one forgotten note would dismantle everything I believed about my family. The rest of the morning went on like nothing had happened. The washer beeped, the city outside buzzed with traffic, and I went through the motions of normal life. But inside, a storm was forming. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the words again, black ink on ivory paper, each letter written with precision. Lydia always wrote like that, even on grocery lists, as if she cared too much about appearances to ever scribble anything messy. That morning, appearances started to mean something darker. From the outside, our lives looked perfect. My name is Margaret Ellis. I'm 58 and have lived in San Francisco my entire life. I built my own perfume business from scratch after my husband passed away, and I've spent every day since making sure our small family stayed whole. My son Daniel is 32, a financial analyst, smart, quiet, the kind of man who always keeps his word. And Lydia? Well, Lydia was the kind of woman who made people turn their heads. She was young, poised, always camera-ready, a lifestyle influencer who made everything she touched seem enviable. She called me Mom, with that sweet Californian warmth that made me believe she meant it. I met her at a launch party for my company's new fragrance line 2 years ago. She smelled like vanilla and champagne, and spoke about family values while live-streaming the entire event. Daniel had brought her over afterward, and I remember thinking how radiant she was. "She makes me feel calm," he told me that night. Calm. That word clung to me now as I thought about the note. There was nothing calm about what I'd just read. I held the note for a long time, then carefully folded it and slipped it back where I found it, inside Daniel's wallet. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, but the words wouldn't let me go. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe they'd had a small argument. But my gut told me otherwise. A mother always knows when something isn't right, even when the house looks spotless and the coffee smells good. I went through the rest of the laundry, pretending to focus on the mundane. Each shirt smelled faintly of Daniel's cologne, sandalwood, and bergamot, and that scent, usually comforting, suddenly felt fragile, like a memory about to vanish. When Daniel and Lydia came over for dinner that evening, the note was all I could think about. Lydia arrived first, smiling like a magazine cover, carrying a box of pastries from her favorite bakery downtown. "Mom, you look so busy," she said, placing the box on the counter. "You should relax more." Her voice was warm, casual, but there was a flicker of something behind her eyes, quick, calculating. I smiled back, forcing myself to stay composed. "I was just doing laundry earlier," I replied. "I found Daniel's wallet in the dryer. Luckily, I checked before it started." She laughed a bit too quickly. "Oh no, did he forget it again? That man would lose his head if it wasn't attached." Daniel came in right after, wrapping an arm around his wife and kissing her temple. He looked tired, thinner than I remembered, with faint shadows under his eyes. I told myself I was imagining it. "Rough week?" I asked. "Just long days," he said, glancing at Lydia. She smiled and brushed invisible lint off his jacket. "He's been working so hard, Mom. I keep telling him to take a break, but he never listens." Her hand lingered on his arm, gentle, possessive. It looked affectionate. But somehow it made my skin crawl. We sat down for dinner, roasted chicken salad, and a bottle of wine Daniel brought. The conversation was polite, the kind of talk families have when everyone's pretending there's nothing wrong. Lydia asked about my business. Daniel mentioned a new client. I nodded, laughed, and played the part of a mother who believed her world was intact. But when Lydia excused herself to take a call, her tone changed. Through the thin wall I could hear her voice low and tense. Yes, I know. I'll make sure he doesn't say anything, just trust me. I froze in mid-bite. Her laughter followed, light but hollow. She returned to the table moments later, face bright again. Sorry, she said, collab stuff. After dinner, Daniel offered to clean up, and Lydia went to the living room scrolling through her phone. I watched her reflection in the window, her perfect posture, her unshakable calm. Everything about her looked composed. I tried to remind myself she'd done nothing wrong, not yet. Maybe that note was part of some inside joke. Maybe the truth was something trivial. But why did Daniel flinch every time she touched him? Why did she keep her phone screen tilted away when he walked by? When they left that night, I hugged my son a little tighter. He smelled faintly of her perfume, sweet but chemical. You sure you're okay? I asked softly. He smiled. A week passed, but the note never left my mind. Every night, I caught myself staring at the laundry room floor, half expecting to find another secret waiting for me. I wanted to believe it meant nothing, that I was being dramatic. Still, something inside me, a quiet, steady ache in my chest, kept whispering that I wasn't wrong. Mothers know when the air changes in their homes, when warmth turns to something that smells faintly of danger. From the outside, Lydia and Daniel's marriage looked like a picture you'd frame in a magazine. Every Sunday, Lydia posted brunch photos with captions like, "Grateful for my little family." Her followers adored her. She replied to every comment with a heart emoji. Whenever she called me mom on camera, it sounded so natural, so sweet. I used to smile when she did that. Now every mom sounded rehearsed. There was no warmth in it anymore, just performance. I still remember the first time Daniel brought her home. She had this presence that filled the room, confident, polite, a little too perfect. She complimented the perfume I was wearing and said, "You must teach me how to make that scent, Mom. It feels like love in a bottle." Back then I laughed. Now those words echoed in my head, each one carefully chosen, each smile too polished. I'd thought I was lucky to have a daughter-in-law like her. Now I wasn't sure if she had ever meant any of it. One Friday evening, Daniel invited me to dinner at their apartment in Pacific Heights. The place overlooked the bay with a wall of glass that framed the sunset like a painting. Lydia met me at the door, wearing a silk blouse and that signature influencer smile. "Mom, come in, you look beautiful." The kitchen smelled of lemongrass and something faintly metallic. "I made detox soup," she said cheerfully. "Daniel's been so tired lately, I want to keep him healthy." Daniel appeared behind her, dressed casually but looking drained. His shirt hung a little loose on his shoulders. I told myself it was just work stress, but his pale skin made my heart twist. "You really should take a few days off," I said, touching his arm. He smiled weakly. "Lydia keeps saying the same thing." Lydia chimed in, "He never listens, Mom, but that's okay, he's got me." The way she said it, soft but possessive, made me uncomfortable. I tried to ignore it, smiling as if everything was fine. We sat down to eat. The soup was bright green, sprinkled with something like ground herbs. It smelled odd, too sweet for vegetables. "It's good for your liver," Lydia explained. "Just a little bitter." She placed a steaming bowl in front of Daniel first, then one for me. I tasted a spoonful to be polite. The flavor hit my tongue, earthy, almost chalky, and I forced myself to swallow. "Interesting taste," I said. Lydia laughed. "It's organic. You'll get used to it." Daniel ate quietly, head bent, obedient. Halfway through dinner, Lydia's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, frowned and muttered, "Sorry, just one sec." She walked into the next room, voice dropping low. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught fragments. "Yes, I already transferred it, before she finds out. Trust me." My spoon froze halfway to my mouth. When she came back, her smile was intact. "Business call," she said, lightly, sitting back down. "Nothing exciting." After dinner, I offered to help clean. Lydia declined. No, go relax with Daniel. I'll handle the dishes." I went to the living room, where Daniel was scrolling through his laptop. He looked exhausted, his eyes unfocused. "How's work treating you?" I asked. "Busy, but fine," he said. "Lydia's helping me with some paperwork actually. She's good with numbers." Something in his tone made me uneasy. Lydia appeared behind him, drying her hands on a towel, her smile never faltering. "He's such a sweetheart," she said. always worrying about me when I'm the one taking care of him. When I got home later that night, I couldn't sleep. The wind outside scraped against the windows and I lay awake replaying every word, every glance. Lydia's phone call echoed in my head before she finds out. Find out what my chest tightened as I remembered the note. If you tell your mother the truth, it's over. The pieces started to connect in ways I didn't want to admit. The next morning I sat at my kitchen table sipping coffee, trying to calm my nerves. My laptop pinged with an email alert. It was from my bank. Joint account transaction confirmation, Ellis Grace Foundation. I blinked. I didn't have a joint account. I clicked the email, and my stomach dropped. $45,000 had been transferred from Daniel's personal account into something called Ellis Grace Foundation. The names listed, Daniel Ellis and Lydia Grace Ellis. Under authorized by, there was Lydia's digital signature. I called Daniel immediately. Did you start a foundation? I asked as evenly as I could. Oh yeah, he said after a pause. Lydia wanted to do something charitable. I haven't really looked at the details yet. That's a lot of money to move without checking, I said softly. He hesitated, then chuckled nervously. It's fine, Mom. Lydia knows what she's doing. I could hear her voice faintly in the background. Tell her it's private. Daniel repeated the words almost mechanically. She says it's private. Then he laughed again as if the conversation was harmless. But to me, those two words, it's private, sounded like a locked door between us. Later that afternoon, I stopped by unannounced carrying a bag of pastries as an excuse. Lydia greeted me warmly but looked surprised. Mom, what a treat. You should have texted, I would have made coffee. Oh, I just happened to be nearby, I said, stepping in. The apartment smelled of lemon cleaner and candles. On the counter, I noticed a stack of unopened mail and one envelope marked confidential. Account transfer. Lydia quickly slid it under another pile, pretending not to notice I'd seen. Daniel walked in from the study, rubbing his temples. I'm getting headaches lately, he said. Probably just stress. Lydia brushed his hair back affectionately. He's been working too hard. I made him my special juice this morning, organic orange with herbs. Her tone was soft, but my stomach churned. I thought of the soup, its bitter taste. I smiled faintly and said, You really take care of him. Of course, Lydia replied, her eyes narrowing slightly. That's what wives do. As the evening wore on, I watched them interact. The tiny gestures that once looked like affection now felt like control. When Daniel reached for his phone, Lydia leaned over and said, No screens during dinner. When I mentioned maybe taking Daniel on a short trip up the coast, she interrupted with a polite laugh. Oh, he can't take time off now, Mom. His work needs him. And Daniel just nodded, quiet, obedient. That wasn't my son. That was someone living under a spell he couldn't see. When I got home, I pulled the email back up and stared at it for a long time. Ellis Grace Foundation. My family's name. My perfume company's name. Twisted into something I hadn't authorized. I opened Daniel's old tax folder, still saved on my home computer, and compared his signature to the digital one from the email. It wasn't the same. Lydia had signed it. My hands trembled as I realized she wasn't just controlling my son, she was rewriting our family's future, one document at a time. That night, I tried calling Daniel again, but it went to voicemail. I left a short message, my voice breaking despite myself. Please call me. I just want to know you're okay. No answer came. I went to bed but couldn't rest. Around midnight, I heard thunder outside and the sound felt like a warning. I looked at the framed photo on my nightstand, the one from their wedding day. Daniel smiling wide, Lydia in white, her hand resting on his chest. In her eyes, I thought I saw love back then. Now looking closer, all I could see was possession. The next morning, I drove past their building just to clear my head. Through the large window, I caught a glimpse of Lydia sitting alone at the breakfast table, her laptop open, her face lit by the screen's glow. She was typing fast, her lips moving as she read something aloud. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw her smile. It wasn't warm or kind. It was the smile of someone who believed she'd already won. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't paranoia or jealousy. Something terrible was unfolding right in front of me, and if I didn't act soon, I might lose my son forever. That Thursday night the house felt too quiet, as if even the walls were holding their breath. The sound of the city outside, traffic voices, sirens, faded into a kind of muffled hum. I sat by the kitchen window, the note still folded in my pocket, its presence burning against my skin, like a secret I wasn't supposed to touch. For a week, I had told myself to stay calm, to let Daniel live his life, but that calm was gone. I could no longer pretend that everything was normal. Somewhere between that note, the mysterious phone call, and the foundation money, something dark was growing inside my family, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next morning, I baked a batch of muffins the way mothers do when they're trying to disguise fear as kindness. I wrapped them neatly in a tin and drove across the bay to Daniel and Lydia's house, telling myself it was just a friendly visit. The air smelled of salt from the ocean, and the fog clung low to the Golden Gate Bridge as I crossed. My fingers gripped the steering wheel until they ached. I didn't know what I was looking for, maybe reassurance, maybe confirmation of the nightmare that had taken root in my mind. Lydia opened the door wearing a white robe and a smile that looked rehearsed. "Mom, what a surprise," she said, pulling her hair into a ponytail. "Come in, please. You didn't have to bring anything. I just thought you two could use some breakfast," I replied. My voice was steady, too steady. The living room was bright, modern, full of the kind of details people post online to prove how happy they are. Vases of fresh flowers, scented candles, designer books, stacked neatly on the coffee table. But something about the air felt off too, still too sterile. The faint smell of bleach mixed with the citrus candle almost made me dizzy. Daniel was sitting on the couch with his laptop, a blanket draped over his knees. He looked pale, his skin waxy under the morning light. "Morning, Mom," he said, trying to smile. "Lydia's been making sure I rest. Just caught a little stomach bug." "Nothing serious," Lydia added quickly, crossing her arms. "He's fine." She said it with the same tone someone might use to end a conversation before it began. I nodded and sat down, placing the muffin tin on the table. "I'll make tea," I said, standing up. Lydia's voice followed me toward the kitchen. "Oh, I already made some green tea this morning. Let me just warm it up." While she busied herself with the kettle, I glanced around the kitchen. A few envelopes sat on the counter, one of them marked "Confidential Transfer Approved." Lydia noticed my gaze, and slid the papers aside with one quick motion, her smile unbroken. "Mom, you worry too much," she said lightly. "We're doing great. Daniel just needs to detox a bit, that's all." "Detox," I repeated softly. "From what? Processed food, stress, city air, you know the usual," she said, laughing. But her eyes didn't match the sound. Daniel excused himself to take a work call, leaving his phone on the table. Lydia began wiping the counter with short, sharp movements, humming under her breath. Her robe sleeve slipped slightly, revealing a faint scratch on her wrist. She noticed me looking and pulled the fabric down quickly. The kettle whistled. "You take honey, right?" she asked, her tone suddenly sweet again. "Yes, thank you," I said, and sat down. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. Then from the hallway I heard Lydia's voice, low, urgent. I realized she was on another call. "Yes. The transfer must happen before she finds out. He already signed it." "No, she suspects nothing. Just make sure the paperwork's ready." Her words were quick-clipped. A pause. "Trust me. After next week everything will be clean." I froze. The tea steamed between my hands, forgotten. Clean. That word hit me like a chill. I stepped closer to the doorway. Lydia's back was to me. She was leaning against the counter, one hand covering her mouth as she listened to whoever was on the other end. "No, he doesn't know," she whispered. "And he won't unless his mother gets in the way." My breath caught. For a second I thought I might drop the cup. I forced my feet to move backward quietly, returning to the living room just as Daniel came in. He smiled, unaware of anything. When Lydia ended the call, she walked in carrying the teapot. Her expression was smooth again, the mask back in place. "Sorry about that, Mom." "Work stuff," she said, pouring tea into my cup. "How's your perfume business?" I stared at her hand as she poured, at the small tremor in her wrist, at the faint residue of white powder on her fingernail. My throat tightened. "Busy," I said. "Lots of orders lately." "That's wonderful," she replied brightly. "Daniel's so proud of you." Daniel sat down again, sipping his tea. "We were talking about expanding the foundation," he said. Lydia wants to organize a gala next month. My stomach turned. That's a big project, I said, forcing a smile. How much money do you need for that? Lydia waved a hand. Oh, we're fine. The initial transfer covered most of it. I looked at Daniel. Transfer, he frowned slightly. Mom, please don't worry. It's all under control. Lydia leaned forward, her eyes locking on mine. You really should relax, Mom. You've worked your whole life. Let us take care of things for once. There was something in the way she said take care of things that made my blood run cold. I nodded, pretending not to understand. You're right, I said softly. Maybe I just need rest. When I left their apartment, the fog had lifted, but my vision felt blurred. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. Every instinct inside me screamed that my son was in danger. Halfway home, I pulled into a gas station and sat there trembling. The phone call, the word transfer, the powder on her nail, the foundation money. It wasn't paranoia. It was a pattern. I scrolled through my contacts and stopped at a name I hadn't seen in years. Dr. Stephen Ortiz. He'd been a close friend of my husband's, now head of toxicology at UCSF Medical Center. When he answered, his voice was the same calm tone I remembered. Margaret, it's been ages. Stephen, I whispered, my throat tight. I think my son's being poisoned. There was silence on the other end for a moment, then his voice dropped low. Tell me everything. I pulled into the parking lot near the waterfront and told him about the soup, the vitamins, the headaches, the transfers. Every detail. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was only the sound of the waves hitting the rocks below. I need you to bring me samples, he said finally. Anything he's been eating or drinking. Hair if possible. Don't tell anyone, not even your son. Can you do that? Yes, I said, though my voice shook. I can. Good. Come by tomorrow morning. I'll run the tests myself. After hanging up, I sat there for a long time watching the water move under the gray sky. The tide was coming in slow but unstoppable. I thought about Lydia's laughter, her polished smile, the way she controlled every detail. I'd once admired her for it. Now I saw it for what it was, a mask hiding a predator's patience. When I finally drove home, the sun was sinking behind the hills, painting the city gold. I should have felt relief, but all I felt was dread. Every mile brought me closer to the truth, and I wasn't sure I wanted to see it. That night I couldn't eat. I sat in the dark, the house silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I opened the drawer beside me and took out the note I'd kept hidden, the one that started it all. The paper was softer now, worn from my hands. I read the line again, "If you tell your mother the truth, it's over." I whispered to the empty room, "It's already over, Lydia." Then I folded the note one last time and slid it back into the drawer. Tomorrow I'd have proof. But tonight I had fear, and the terrible certainty that I was running out of time to save my son. The fog was still heavy over the city when I parked outside the UCSF Medical Center. The air smelled faintly of rain and disinfectant. I walked fast, clutching the small plastic bag under my coat, like it was something fragile and dangerous, which it was. Inside were strands of Daniel's hair I had brushed from his jacket, and a small container of soup I'd taken from his fridge, while Lydia was distracted the night before. My hands were cold even through my gloves. Every step I took felt like walking deeper into a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Dr. Stephen Ortiz met me in the hospital corridor. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, his eyes sharp but kind behind his glasses. "Margaret," he said, touching my shoulder gently. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't," I admitted. "I just need to know, Stephen, please." He guided me into his office, a quiet space lined with shelves of medical journals and awards. "Tell me everything," he said. I did. I told him about the soup, the headaches, the foundation money, the note, the phone call. His expression changed slowly from concern to disbelief to something darker. When I finished, there was a long silence. He folded his hands. "I've seen this pattern before," he said. My stomach dropped. "Pattern chronic poisoning," he said softly. "Usually slow, deliberate, disguised as fatigue or stress. I'll test everything you brought." The words hung between us, heavy and suffocating. "You think Lydia," he raised a hand. "Let's not assume. But if what you're describing is true, we need to act quickly. Do you have any of his recent blood work?" I shook my head. Just a routine checkup last month. They said he was fine. Ortiz frowned. Stress doesn't cause white streaks in nails or constant nausea. He stood up, opening a small sterile kit. We'll start with these samples. Soup, hair, anything that could show trace metals or toxins. You'll have results within 2 days. I nodded, my throat tight. Thank you, Stephen. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking again. Margaret, if this turns out to be poisoning, it's not just a crime. It's attempted murder. Are you ready for that truth? I didn't answer right away. My voice barely came out when I finally spoke. I'm ready for whatever it takes to save my son. By the time I left the hospital, the sun had broken through the fog. It should have felt like relief, but it didn't. The light seemed too bright, too clean for what I was carrying. On the drive home, I replayed Stephen's words, chronic poisoning. My mind kept wandering to Lydia's voice, her smile, her perfect meals. Every gesture now seemed sinister, every kind word rehearsed. That evening I decided I needed more proof. I drove to Daniel's house again, telling myself it was just to check on him. Lydia greeted me with her usual glow. Mom, 2 visits in 1 week. Daniel will think you miss us too much, she teased. I smiled, forcing calm. I baked something new. Fig tart with honey. How lovely, she said, opening the door. Come in. Daniel's resting. While she disappeared into the living room to set the table, I slipped quietly toward the kitchen. The refrigerator door creaked open softly. Rows of glass containers lined the shelves, soups, juices, neatly labeled with dates. I opened one marked Monday, lunch. The smell was faintly sweet, metallic, almost chemical. My hands trembled as I poured a small sample into a bag I'd brought. I tucked it into my purse just as Lydia's footsteps approached. Everything okay, Mom? She asked, lightly. Just admiring your organization, I said. You're very thorough. She smiled, unaware. It's important to keep things in order. Her words made me shiver. Daniel appeared a moment later, rubbing his eyes. Hey, Mom. You didn't tell me you were coming. I wanted to check on you, I said. How do you feel? He smiled faintly. Better, I think. Lydia's making me some kind of vitamin mix. I glanced at the countertop. There it was, a small brown bottle labeled Private Blend. Lydia followed my gaze and picked it up quickly. Natural herbs, she said. Helps his energy. Of course, I replied. You're taking good care of him. I try, she said, with that same practiced smile. I left not long after. As soon as I stepped into the cold night air, my chest tightened. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I'd held myself together in front of her, but once I was alone in the car, the tears came. I wasn't sure if it was fear or fury, maybe both. The next morning my phone rang. It was Ortiz. Come to my office, he said. His tone was flat, clinical, the kind of tone that hides bad news. When I arrived, he was standing by a light table covered with reports. We ran the tests 3 times, he began. There's no mistake. The soup sample you gave me contains traces of arsenic. Not enough to kill immediately, but enough to cause long-term organ damage if ingested daily. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. How long would it take? Months, he said. Maybe longer. It's the kind of dose that keeps a person weak, dependent, slowly fading. I pressed a hand to my chest. Stephen, are you sure? He looked me in the eyes. I'm sure. The room spun. I gripped the edge of his desk to keep myself upright. She's poisoning him. He nodded slowly. It looks deliberate. You need to keep Daniel away from anything she gives him. I'll notify my contact in law enforcement, but be careful. Don't confront her yet. I can't just stand by, I said. What if she gives him more? Then you get evidence, he replied. Food samples, documents, whatever you can. Once we have enough, the police will act. I nodded weakly, wiping my eyes. Thank you. When I stepped outside, the sky was clear blue and cold. I should have felt victorious for having proof. Instead, I felt hollow. The truth I'd wanted now terrified me. Lydia wasn't just manipulating Daniel, she was killing him slowly. And he didn't even know. That afternoon I drove aimlessly through the city, ending up in front of a small church I hadn't visited in years. I went inside and sat in the last pew, staring at the flickering candles. The wax smell mixed with the faint scent of old wood. I hadn't prayed in a long time, but the words came anyway. Please, I whispered. Just give me strength. I thought of my husband gone 10 years now. He'd always believed that honesty and kindness could save anyone. But kindness wouldn't save Daniel now, action would. When I left the church, the decision was already made. I couldn't let Lydia have one more day of control. That evening, I called Harold Bennett, our family lawyer. He sounded surprised to hear from me. "Margaret, it's been years. What's wrong? I need you to review my estate documents," I said. "And Daniel's trust. Something's off. Come by tomorrow," he said cautiously. "We'll go through everything." I hung up and looked toward the city lights beyond my window. In the reflection, I could see my own face, older, harder, unfamiliar. Then my phone buzzed again. A text from Ortiz. "Keep everything quiet. Bring the paperwork too. If this involves inheritance, she has motive." I stared at the message for a long time. The word motive felt final, like the closing of a door. Outside, the city lights shimmered on the water. Inside, I felt a strange calm. The fear that had haunted me for weeks turned into something else: resolve. Lydia had built her plan carefully, poisoning Daniel's body and my trust, one drop at a time. But she had underestimated the one thing stronger than her ambition: a mother who finally knew the truth. Harold Bennett's office sat on the 12th floor of a sandstone building downtown, overlooking the gray shimmer of San Francisco Bay. When I stepped out of the elevator that morning, the smell of old paper and polished wood wrapped around me like memory. Harold had been our lawyer for over 20 years. He'd handled everything from my husband's estate to the launch of my perfume brand. If there was anyone who knew where my family's money had gone or was going, it was him. He looked up from behind a stack of documents when I entered. "Margaret Ellis," he said, his voice warm but cautious. "It's been a long time. You look troubled." "I am," I said. "I need your help." He gestured toward the leather chair across from him. "Sit. Tell me what's going on." I set my purse on the desk, pulled out the printed email about the Ellis Grace Foundation and slid it toward him. "Do you recognize this?" He adjusted his glasses, studying it. "Foundation registered under Daniel Ellis and Lydia Grace Ellis." His brow furrowed. "I've never handled any documents for this." "When was it created?" 2 months ago, I said quietly. He typed something into his computer, scanning through state business registries. The faint glow from the monitor lit up his face as he frowned deeper. "Well, this is interesting. The foundation's legal all right, but its listed managing director is Lydia Ellis. She has full authority to make financial decisions. Total assets $420,000. My throat went dry. That's nearly all of Daniel's savings. Harold looked up at me. "She transferred it from his private investment account. I can see the banking code." "She told him it was charity," I whispered. He leaned back, sighing. "If it's charity, it's a strange one. Most of the money went to a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Hardly a local cause." The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. "She's cleaning him out," I said, almost to myself. "She's not just cleaning him out," Harold corrected softly. "She's setting up a new financial identity. Once he's out of the picture, she'll control everything that bears your family's name." The words hit me like a slap. Out of the picture. I remembered Dr. Ortiz's voice telling me that Daniel's test results showed arsenic. I saw Lydia smiling across the dinner table, serving soup with steady hands. Harold must have noticed the look on my face. "Margaret," he said carefully, "you need to involve law enforcement. This is bigger than just a financial issue." "I already did," I said. "There's a detective. But I need to understand what Lydia gains if Daniel dies." He hesitated, then opened a drawer and pulled out a thick binder. "Here," he said, flipping through pages. "Your family trust, signed years ago." And this, he held up a second document, "is a recent amendment Daniel filed." My pulse quickened. An amendment, yes. It was sent through my associate last month. He turned the document toward me. If Daniel were to pass away, Lydia would inherit his entire share of the trust, including partial control of your company's voting stock. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. Daniel's name was there, but the handwriting was off, too neat, too careful. "This isn't his signature," I said. "It's traced." Harold nodded grimly. "I thought so too. But it came with a notarized confirmation. Someone helped her." I felt a wave of nausea. She forged it. He sighed, rubbing his temples. It's a sophisticated setup, Margaret. And if she's willing to commit fraud, she won't stop there. I leaned back in the chair, my heart hammering. Every moment of the last few weeks flashed in my mind: the note, the soup, the foundation, the quiet way Daniel's eyes looked when he said he was fine. Harold's voice softened. You've always been smart, calm. But you can't face this alone. I don't plan to, I said. I just need to know what I'm up against. He closed the file, meeting my eyes. Then listen carefully. Lydia's building a web: financial, legal, medical. If Daniel dies, she inherits everything. If you're declared unfit to run the company, she controls the rest. The moment that paper is filed, she wins. I stood slowly, gripping the edge of his desk. Then we don't give her that moment. As I left his office, the city outside looked sharper, somehow its noise, distant, unreal. I drove aimlessly for a few blocks before pulling into a cafe parking lot. I called Daniel. He answered on the third ring. Hey Mom, everything okay? Can we meet? I asked. Now I've got a meeting in 30 minutes. It's important. A pause. Okay. 10 minutes. The cafe, by the Embarcadero. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting near the window with a cup of coffee. His smile was tired. You sound serious, he said. I sat down and slid a printed page across the table, the trust amendment. Did you sign this? He frowned, reading it. Yeah, I think so. Lydia said it was for tax reasons. Daniel, I said quietly, this gives her control of everything, if anything happens to you or me. He blinked, confused. That can't be right. She wouldn't, she would. My voice trembled despite myself. She's taking your money. She's isolating you. Stephen tested the soup. It had arsenic in it. He recoiled, his face paling. Mom, that's impossible. It's not. I have the report. For a long time he said nothing. Then he shook his head, eyes wide with disbelief. You've got it wrong. Lydia loves me. She's been taking care of me. Maybe you're reading too much into things. Do I look like I'm imagining this? I said sharply, pushing the page toward him. Look at your signature. Look at what she's done. He looked down at the paper, hands trembling slightly. She wouldn't hurt me, he whispered. She already has, I said. He pushed back from the table, suddenly, voice rising. Stop it, Mom. You've hated her from the start. She's not perfect, but she's my wife. Heads turned from nearby tables. He lowered his voice. You're just jealous. You can't stand that someone else takes care of me now. The words cut deep, sharper than I expected. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I don't want to take care of you, I said softly. I want you alive. He stared at me, torn between anger and fear. Then he stood up and walked out without another word. I sat there long after he was gone, staring at the untouched coffee between my hands. My reflection in the dark liquid looked like a stranger's, tired, desperate older. That night my phone rang. It was Dr. Ortiz. Margaret, are you sitting down? I'm listening, I said. The second sample you gave me, the juice labeled Monday, had double the arsenic concentration of the soup. I swallowed hard. She's increasing the dose. I'm afraid so, he said. If he keeps drinking it, he won't last more than a few weeks. For a moment I couldn't breathe. What do I do? Get law enforcement involved now. Tell them everything. After the call, I went to my study and pulled open the drawer with the note. I unfolded it again under the lamplight, tracing the words with my finger. If you tell your mother the truth, it's over. This time I whispered back to it. You're right. It is over. The next morning, I was sitting in a corner booth of a dim cafe when Detective Rachel Brooks arrived. She was tall, dark-haired, and had the kind of quiet confidence that made people lower their voices when she walked in. Mrs. Ellis, she said, sliding into the seat across from me. I've reviewed Dr. Ortiz's report and your lawyer's findings. This is serious, I know, I said. We'll handle this carefully, she continued. We'll get a warrant, set surveillance, and collect samples ourselves. But you need to act normal around her. If she suspects anything, she might panic, and panic makes people dangerous. I nodded. Whatever it takes. Rachel leaned forward, her voice low. If she's after money and power, we hit her where it hurts. Make her think the inheritance is slipping away. Greed will make her expose herself. A strange calm came over me. I can do that, I said. When she left, I sat there for a long time watching the rain streak down the window. I'd spent my whole life creating beauty, bottling it, naming it, selling it. But some beauty hides rot beneath its surface, like a flower grown in poison. Now I was done admiring the surface. It was time to dig up the roots. The plan began the next morning. Rachel's voice echoed in my head as I stood by the kitchen window watching the sunlight creep across the counter. Attack her motive, the money. Make her believe it's slipping away. I could still see her eyes steady and unblinking. If Lydia's built her life on greed, then take the floor out from under her. At first, the idea terrified me. I'd never been someone who plotted. My life had been about scent, texture, light, beauty, not strategy. But now every breath I took was war. I called my lawyer Harold, pretending to sound calm. Harold, could you come by the house this afternoon? I've decided to make some changes to my will. He hesitated. Of course. Everything all right? Yes, I said. Perfectly fine. But nothing was fine. Lydia was in the kitchen that morning, dressed in pale blue silk pajamas, humming softly as she sliced fruit. You're up early, Mom, she said without turning. Coffee's almost ready. Thank you, I replied, pouring myself a cup. I was just on the phone with Harold Bennett. The knife paused for a fraction of a second before she continued slicing. Oh, what about my estate? I said casually. I've been thinking of donating most of it to charity. It's time to give back. She looked up, her smile, bright but strained. That's very generous of you. I think so too, I said, sipping my coffee. He's coming by later today. She nodded, but her grip on the knife tightened. I saw the faintest flicker of panic in her eyes before she quickly lowered her gaze. Well, she said, I'm sure Daniel will support whatever you decide. I'm sure he will, I replied softly. When Harold arrived that afternoon, Lydia was arranging flowers in the foyer. Her smile returned, but this time it was paper thin. Mr. Bennett, she said sweetly. What a lovely surprise. Just business, he said politely. Mrs. Ellis asked me to go over a few details with her. Of course, Lydia replied, but her voice caught slightly on the word details. We sat in the living room with the large windows open so that every word could drift down the hallway where Lydia was watering plants. I've decided to donate 80% of my estate to a foundation for women who've lost family to financial abuse, I said, projecting my voice just enough. Harold caught on immediately. That's a noble idea, Mrs. Ellis. We'll make the arrangements. I'd like it official within the month, I continued. Before my next board meeting. It feels right. From the corner of my eye I saw Lydia freeze. Her hand stopped on the watering can and she turned slightly toward us. 80%, she repeated softly as if testing the words in her mouth. Yes, I said, meeting her gaze. 80%. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. You've always had such a big heart, Mom, she said. I'll get some tea for you and Mr. Bennett. As soon as she turned away, Harold whispered. She heard every word. I wanted her to, I said. That night, Lydia was quiet at dinner. Daniel chatted about work, but his wife barely spoke. Her fork rested untouched beside her plate. You okay, honey? Daniel asked. Fine, she said too quickly. Just a headache. When he excused himself to take a call, she turned to me. Her voice was low and controlled. It must be nice deciding the future like that. I've earned the right, I said. She smiled thinly. And what about Daniel's future? He'll be fine, I said. He always lands on his feet. Something dark flickered across her face. Not everyone does. Before I could respond, she stood and began clearing the plates, her movements sharp, deliberate. After they went to bed, I stepped outside to call Rachel. The night was cold, the sky glowing faintly over the bay. She heard everything I said, quietly. She's scared. Good, Rachel replied. Fear makes people sloppy. Keep pushing. The next morning, Lydia's demeanor changed. She was overly cheerful, humming around the house, making Daniel's breakfast, leaving fresh flowers on my desk. It was too much, too polished. By noon, she mentioned the will herself. You know, Mom, she said lightly, if you're donating so much to charity, maybe we can host a benefit gala through the foundation. It would make such great publicity for your company. I smiled. That's a wonderful idea. I'll ask Harold to handle the details. Her smile faltered. Oh, there's no need. I can take care of it. I insist, I said. Her jaw tightened. Of course. That night Daniel went to bed early. I stayed up reading in the living room, though my eyes never moved across the page. Around 11, I heard movement in the kitchen, soft, deliberate steps. I set the book down and walked quietly toward the sound. Through the crack of the door, I saw Lydia standing at the counter, her back to me. She wore a silk robe, her hair pulled back, her movements quick and precise. She opened a small glass bottle, the same one I'd seen labeled Private Blend, and poured a white powder into a new jar marked Supplements. My breath caught, but I forced myself not to move. She capped the jar, wiped the counter with a cloth, and exhaled shakily. Then she whispered to herself, "If she really changes that will, I can't wait another month." I stepped back quietly, my pulse pounding in my ears. She was planning something immediate. The next day Daniel looked worse. His skin had taken on a yellowish hue, and his hands trembled slightly when he poured his coffee. "You need to see a doctor," I said gently. Lydia said, "It's just fatigue," he replied. "Humor me," I said. "Get checked today." He promised he would, but I knew he wouldn't. Lydia wouldn't let him. That afternoon Rachel called. "We're installing cameras tonight," she said. "Hidden ones. We'll need access while they're out." "They're going to dinner with friends," I said. "You'll have an hour." When the technicians arrived, everything moved like clockwork. Tiny lenses embedded in light fixtures, one in the pantry, one under the counter near the stove. When they left, the house looked untouched. That night, Lydia came home earlier than expected. She walked into the kitchen, poured herself wine, and began pacing. "You're not winning, Margaret," she muttered, unaware of the silent witness above her. "You've had your time." The next morning I acted normal. I smiled at breakfast, complimented her cooking, even laughed at her small jokes. She relaxed slightly, thinking she'd regained control. By evening I was at Rachel's office. The first footage loaded onto her computer. There it was, Lydia alone in the kitchen, carefully mixing the powder into Daniel's food, her expression cold and methodical. Rachel leaned forward. "We've got her." I couldn't speak. My eyes were locked on the screen. Seeing it confirmed everything I'd feared, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like grief. "She'll do it again soon," Rachel said. "We'll be ready. But you need to stay calm." I nodded. "I will." When I got home, Lydia was sitting on the porch with a glass of wine. The moonlight made her face look softer, almost innocent. "You and Daniel should come with me to Napa next weekend," she said. "A little getaway." "Sounds lovely," I said. She smiled, but her eyes were sharp. "You'll see. We could all use a reset." I went inside, closing the door behind me. The cameras were watching, the evidence was building, and Lydia had no idea the walls were closing in. I went to bed that night with my heart pounding, one thought repeating over and over. The next time she tried to poison him, she wouldn't just be feeding him, she'd be feeding her own downfall. Rain tapped against the kitchen window like impatient fingers. I stood at the counter pouring tea, pretending to focus on the steam while my eyes traced Lydia's reflection in the glass. She was on the phone again, pacing slowly, her voice low and sharp. "Yes. Thursday night. I'll make sure he eats at home. It has to look natural this time." She turned slightly, and her tone softened. "No, she won't interfere. She thinks she's winning." I set the cup down before it could slip from my hand. I stepped away silently, heart pounding, and went straight to my room. The rain outside drowned out my footsteps. I dialed Rachel's number with shaking fingers. "She's planning something Thursday night," I whispered. "You have to be ready." Rachel's voice was calm as ever. "We'll have eyes on her. Don't confront her yet, Margaret. Let her make the move. We'll stop it before anyone gets hurt." After hanging up, I sat on the edge of my bed, the phone still warm in my hand. My mind replayed Lydia's words over and over. "It has to look natural." I stared at the ceiling until the shapes blurred. Thursday wasn't far away, and the thought of waiting through every hour until then felt unbearable. The next morning Lydia was back to her polished self-brunch photos, scented candles, a bright yellow dress. "I'm making Daniel his favorite tonight," she said cheerfully. "Roast chicken and a new recipe for lemon soup." She glanced at me with that familiar smile, the one that never reached her eyes. "Would you like to join us? I wouldn't miss it," I said. She froze for a moment, then laughed lightly. "Wonderful." Daniel came down the stairs soon after, already dressed for work. "You're coming tonight, Mom, that's nice." Lydia says it'll be a special dinner. I'm sure it will be, I said. I kissed his cheek before he left, and my fingers lingered on his face a second longer than usual. He didn't notice. The rest of the day crawled by. I couldn't focus on anything. Every sound in the house made me flinch, the kettle, the rain gutters, the faint creak of the hallway floorboards. Lydia spent most of the afternoon preparing dinner. She hummed as she chopped vegetables, every movement precise like a ritual. I watched from the doorway, arms folded, pretending to be casual. At one point she turned to me and smiled. "You're staring, Mom. Do you want to help?" "No," I said softly. "I just enjoy watching you work." Her expression faltered for a fraction of a second before she returned to her humming. She reached for a small glass vial, twisted the cap open, and tipped a white powder into the simmering broth. Her hand moved delicately, almost lovingly. The camera hidden above the pantry door caught everything. When Daniel returned home, the smell of lemon and herbs filled the air. He looked pale but cheerful. "Smells amazing," he said, kissing Lydia's cheek. She giggled, slipping her arms around his waist. "Just for you." We sat down at the table. Lydia ladled the soup into Daniel's bowl first, her hand steady, her smile unwavering. "Tell me what you think," she said sweetly. Daniel dipped the spoon and took a small sip. "It's good," he said, though his tone sounded distracted. He rubbed his stomach lightly. "Maybe I'm not that hungry." "Nonsense," Lydia said, pushing the bowl closer. "You've been skipping meals all week." I felt my pulse in my throat. "Daniel," I said, forcing a smile, "let me try it first." Lydia's eyes flickered up. "Of course, Mom. But be careful, it's hot." I lifted the spoon, blowing on it slowly, pretending to taste it. "Delicious," I said. "I can see why he loves it." Daniel smiled faintly. Lydia relaxed. The performance continued. After dinner, I excused myself and went to the garden, dialing Rachel immediately. "It's happening now," I whispered. She put something in the soup. Rachel's voice was urgent. "Don't let him eat more. We're on our way." I returned to the kitchen. Lydia was washing dishes, humming again. Daniel sat on the couch, his eyes half closed. "You okay, sweetheart?" I asked. He smiled weakly. "Just tired." I turned to Lydia. "Maybe he needs something stronger than detox. Vitamins aren't working." She kept her back to me. "He just needs rest." I stepped closer. "He's been resting for months. Look at him." She turned, her expression sharp. "Don't start, Margaret." "Start what?" I asked, voice calm. "Asking why my son looks like he's dying under your care." Her eyes narrowed. "You're imagining things. You always do. You hate that he chose me over you." "I hate that you're killing him," I said softly. The room went silent except for the rain outside. Lydia stared at me, her face unreadable, then she laughed, a sound so brittle it almost cracked the air. "You're insane," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. Before she could speak again, headlights flashed through the window. 2 unmarked cars stopped outside. Lydia's smile faded. "Expecting company?" I asked quietly. She backed away, shaking her head. "What did you do?" The door opened and Rachel stepped in, followed by 2 officers. Her tone was firm. "Mrs. Ellis, please step aside." Lydia's hands trembled. "What is this? You can't just..." Rachel held up a tablet, pressing play. The footage from the kitchen camera filled the screen, Lydia pouring the powder into the soup, her face cold and focused. "No," Lydia whispered. "That's not..." "It's enough," Rachel said. "We have a warrant." Lydia turned to me, eyes wide, fury and fear swirling together. "You set me up." "No," I said. "You set yourself up." As the officers cuffed her hands, Daniel stumbled from the couch. "What's going on?" His voice cracked. Lydia tried to reach him, crying now. "Danny, please." "They're lying. She's lying." He looked at her, confusion turning to horror as Rachel showed him the tablet. "She's been poisoning you," she said quietly. "We tested your blood this morning. The results confirm it." Daniel swayed on his feet, staring at his wife. "Why?" he whispered. Lydia's shoulders shook. "I just wanted us to be secure." "Your mother was cutting us out," she said. "She'd give everything away because you were stealing it," I said. She turned on me, her voice breaking. "You ruined everything." Rachel signaled the officers and they led her toward the door. Lydia's sobs echoed down the hall. "He loved me," she shouted as they pushed her into the rain. He still loves me. Daniel stood frozen, his face pale and hollow. I walked to him, placing my hand on his shoulder. It's over, I whispered. He sank to his knees, his hands covering his face. Mom, how did I not see it? You didn't want to, I said gently. Love makes fools of us all. Outside, the red and blue lights painted the wet pavement in streaks of color. I watched them fade as the car carrying Lydia disappeared down the street. Inside, Daniel began to shake. She could have killed me. I knelt beside him, holding his trembling hands. But she didn't. You're here, you're safe now. For the first time in weeks, I let myself breathe. The house, once filled with the scent of perfume and deceit, smelled of rain and soap. Clean. Rachel came back, in her voice soft but firm. We'll need you both at the precinct tomorrow to sign statements. The food samples will go straight to the lab. This should be enough for an indictment. I nodded. Thank you, detective. She looked at me for a moment. You did what mothers do. You protected your child. After she left, I helped Daniel to his room. He lay down, exhausted, his breathing uneven. I sat beside him, stroking his hair the way I used to when he was little. His skin was cold but his pulse was steady. Sleep, I said softly. We'll fix everything tomorrow. He closed his eyes, whispering, I'm sorry, Mom. I kissed his forehead. You have nothing to be sorry for. As I turned off the light, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back looked older, sharper, but unbroken. I thought of all the nights I'd doubted myself, all the times I'd questioned whether my instincts were wrong. They weren't. Downstairs, the kitchen was quiet again. The bowl of soup sat untouched on the counter, steam long gone, the surface calm and deceptive, just like the woman who'd made it. I poured it down the drain. The sound was final cleansing. For the first time in months, I slept without fear. The morning after Lydia's arrest, sunlight poured through the blinds like it had been waiting years to get in. For the first time in months, the house didn't smell like chemicals or lemon candles, it smelled like fresh air. I brewed coffee, the simple act feeling like a small miracle, and watched the steam rise from the cup. Upstairs, Daniel was still asleep. I could hear his breathing from the hallway, slow and heavy, the sound of a man who'd finally stopped fighting for a while. When the doorbell rang, my heart jumped, even though I knew who it was. Detective Rachel Brooks stood outside, trenchcoat, damp from the early fog, a folder in her hand. Good morning, Mrs. Ellis, she said softly. I thought we could talk before the press gets wind of anything. I stepped aside to let her in. Coffee, please, she said, sitting at the kitchen table. Long night. I poured 2 mugs and joined her. For a moment, we just sat there, both of us too tired for ceremony. They're processing her now, Rachel said, finally. Your daughter-in-law didn't sleep all night. She's claiming she was coerced, that she thought it was a vitamin additive. Her attorney's already trying to spin it into an accident. She's still pretending, I said quietly. She'll have to do better than pretending, Rachel replied. The lab found arsenic in both the soup and the orange juice. That's 2 independent samples, both laced. The videos alone are enough for attempted murder. I nodded, staring into my coffee. And Daniel, he'll need a full medical evaluation, Rachel said gently. But the good news is, he's out of danger. The dose was increasing, but you stopped it in time. I felt tears sting the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away. He doesn't believe it yet, I said. I think part of him still hopes she'll walk through that door and tell him it was all a mistake. Rachel's voice softened. That's normal. People don't fall out of love just because the truth finally showed up. We sat in silence for a long while. Outside, the sound of seagulls drifted faintly from the bay. The city felt calm again, but inside me the storm was still settling. By afternoon, Daniel came downstairs. He looked frail but better, the color starting to return to his skin. Detective, he greeted quietly. I didn't expect you. Rachel stood. I just wanted to check in. How are you feeling? He hesitated. Numb, mostly. I keep thinking I'll wake up and none of this will be real. It's real, I said softly. But you're still here. He nodded, looking down at his hands. They were trembling slightly. She called me from the station, he said suddenly. They let her make 1 call. My stomach tightened. What did she say? She said she loved me, he whispered. That she did everything for us. That you, he looked at me, eyes filled with pain, you turned her into the villain. Rachel shook her head. Daniel, she was the one who poisoned you. He pressed his palms against his face. I know. It's just, I don't understand how someone can say they love you and still want you gone. I reached across the table and took his hand. Because love was never what she wanted control. You can't confuse one for the other. He nodded slowly, silent tears falling onto the table. Rachel gathered her notes, giving us space. We'll have officers outside your property for a few days, she said. Just procedure. After she left, Daniel sat at the window staring at the street below. Mom, he said, finally I don't know who I am without her. You're who you've always been, I said. You just forgot for a while. He didn't answer. The sunlight fell across his face sharp and clear. For the first time I saw the boy I used to know, the one who used to laugh freely, who used to trust without hesitation. I realized how much of him she'd taken piece by piece, not just through poison but through fear. That night he asked me to stay upstairs with him. I sat on the edge of his bed while he lay staring at the ceiling. Do you think she'll go to prison? He asked. She will, I said. Rachel has everything she needs. He turned his head slightly. Do you think she'll ever say she's sorry? I sighed. Some people only say sorry to save themselves, not because they mean it. He closed his eyes and for the first time in months he fell asleep without tossing or groaning. I stayed there until the house went quiet, the only sound, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and the faint hum of the night outside. When I finally went downstairs, I saw the mail on the counter, an envelope addressed to Daniel from the Ellis Grace Foundation. My chest tightened. I opened it carefully. Inside was a printout of a transfer confirmation, another one. It showed that Lydia had tried to move more money 2 days before her arrest. The amount was large enough to cripple the company if it had gone through. But the transfer was blocked. I looked at the date stamp, blocked 20 minutes after I'd called Harold about changing my will. Lydia must have realized then that she was running out of time. The next morning I met Harold at his office again. She moved fast, I told him, sliding the document across his desk. She was desperate, he said. But this is good. It proves intent. Between this and the poisoning, there's no doubt she was planning to eliminate both of you. I want to make sure Daniel's share is protected, I said. I don't want her or anyone connected to her touching a cent of it. Harold nodded. Already in motion. And I've contacted the court to freeze all her accounts. I leaned back in the chair, exhaling for what felt like the first time in days. She thought she was clever, I said quietly. She forgot that greed always leaves fingerprints. That afternoon when I got home, Daniel was sitting on the patio staring out at the water. He looked up as I approached. I've been thinking, he said. About what happens now. You take time, I said. You heal. He shook his head. No, Mom. I mean us. The company. The brand. I can't let what she did define the rest of our lives. I smiled faintly. You sound like your father. He smiled back, the first real smile I'd seen in months. Maybe I finally remember him. The next few days passed quietly. Reporters began to gather outside, but I ignored them. The story was spreading. Influencer arrested for poisoning husband. The headlines were cruel, but the truth was finally louder than the lies. At night I'd stand by the window and look toward the city lights. For weeks I had lived inside fear so thick I could barely breathe. Now there was space to feel again, to grieve, to rest, to plan. But peace is never instant. One evening as I sat by Daniel's bed reading, his phone buzzed. He picked it up, glanced at the screen and froze. It's her, he whispered. My chest tightened. Don't answer. He stared at it for a long moment, then turned it over face down. I won't, he said. The next morning Rachel called. We recovered a recording, she said. During booking, Lydia admitted to everything. Not to us but to herself. We caught it on the holding cell mic. What did she say? I asked. She said, I thought love meant ownership. I thought if I couldn't have him, no one should. The line was silent for a long moment after that. When I hung up, I walked into Daniel's room. He was sitting by the window again, sunlight on his face. I told him what Rachel had said. He didn't speak, just looked out at the horizon, eyes glistening. I guess she finally told the truth, he said quietly. Yes, I said. But too late for it to matter. He nodded, And for the first time there was no sadness in his expression, just relief. That night after Daniel had gone to bed, I sat at my desk and opened a blank notebook. I began writing, not for anyone else, just to remember. Everything, every fear, every choice, every small victory. I didn't want the story to fade. Not because it was painful, but because it had taught me something I never wanted to forget. Sometimes justice doesn't come with anger. Sometimes it comes with the quiet knowledge that you survived and that surviving is its own kind of revenge. As I set down my pen, I looked toward the stairs. Daniel's door was closed, a thin line of light beneath it. For the first time, I believed we might really be safe. It was 3 days after Lydia's confession, when the storm rolled in from the Pacific, dark and loud, shaking the windows. I was sitting in the car outside Daniel's house watching the wind whip across the streetlights when my phone buzzed. Rachel's voice came through, calm but tense. "Margaret, she's being transferred tonight from Holding to county jail. It's routine, but I wanted you to know. She requested a final property visit to collect personal belongings from Daniel's home before the court seizes them. She wants to come here," I asked, gripping the phone tighter. "She's not allowed to enter the house alone," Rachel said. "But legally, she can retrieve personal items with police supervision. I'll be there. You and Daniel don't have to attend." I looked up at the light shining from Daniel's window. He'd barely slept since the arrest. Every time I caught his eyes there was that haunted disbelief again, the face of a man who still couldn't understand how love could turn so venomous. "We'll be there," I said. "If she wants a final act, she's not performing it without us." Rachel hesitated. "All right, just be careful. These visits get emotional." The visit was set for 10 p.m. By then the rain had turned to a steady torrent. I stood by the window as headlights appeared at the end of the driveway, a police van followed by Rachel's unmarked car. The sight of it made my stomach twist. Daniel came down the stairs, pale and tense, his hands buried in his pockets. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I asked. "I have to," he said quietly. "I need to see her face one more time so I can stop seeing her in my dreams." The front door opened with a knock, firm and cold. 2 officers entered first, dripping water onto the floor. Lydia followed between them, wearing an orange jumpsuit and a raincoat thrown over her shoulders. Her wrists were cuffed, but her chin was still lifted, her eyes sharp and defiant. The house fell silent except for the distant rumble of thunder. 5 minutes, Rachel said. Supervised. Lydia's gaze moved around the living room, tracing every surface, every object she once owned. Her eyes landed on Daniel. For a moment her face softened, and I saw the woman she used to pretend to be the one who had charmed him, charmed us all. "Danny," she whispered, voice trembling. "You've lost weight." He didn't answer. His jaw tightened. "I never wanted this," she said. "You have to believe that." "I believed everything you said once," he replied, his voice low but steady. "That nearly killed me." She took a slow breath, glancing toward the officers. "Can I just get my ring?" she asked. "It's on the dresser upstairs." Rachel nodded to one of the officers who started to follow her, but Lydia turned, pleading. "Please, I can find it faster alone. You can watch me from the hallway." The officer looked at Rachel. She gave a reluctant nod. "Go. 2 minutes. Stay in sight." Lydia started up the stairs. Her steps were light, practiced. I could almost hear the echo of her old life in that walk, the confidence, the illusion of grace. When she disappeared around the landing, I felt Daniel stiffen beside me. Rachel leaned against the wall, one hand near her holster. "Don't worry," she said quietly, "she's not getting far." But something about the silence above made my skin crawl. After a minute, we heard a sound, something metallic, faint, but distinct. Rachel frowned and started up the stairs. I followed her, heart pounding. Lydia stood in the doorway of the bedroom, raincoat open, her back turned to us. The drawer was half open. When Rachel stepped closer, Lydia spun around. In her hand was a small pair of scissors from the vanity table. Her eyes were wide, wild. "Put it down," Rachel said sharply. Lydia's voice cracked. "I just wanted to see it all one last time. My house, my husband, everything she stole from me." Her gaze snapped to me. "You think you won, don't you? You think you can take everything from me and still sleep at night?" Rachel's hand was steady. "Drop the scissors, Lydia. Lydia laughed, a sound so hollow it made my stomach turn. You ruined everything, Margaret. You turned him against me. You couldn't stand to share him. You poisoned him, I said quietly. That's not love. That's fear, dressed as devotion. Her breath came in short bursts. I wanted him safe, I wanted control because you never let me have any. She took one step forward. The officers rushed in from behind, Rachel shouting for her to stop. Lydia's shoulders slumped, and for a second I thought she'd given up. Then she dropped the scissors to the floor and started to cry. Daniel appeared at the doorway, his face pale but resolute. It's over, he said. She looked up at him through tears. You used to call me your peace. He hesitated, pain flickering in his eyes. You were my storm, he said quietly. The officers took her arms and led her back down the stairs. She didn't fight this time. When she passed me, she stopped. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time there was no hatred, only emptiness. You know you'll never really have him, she whispered. Because I'll always be part of his story. I didn't respond. I just watched as they led her out into the rain. Rachel exhaled, rubbing her forehead. That could have gone worse. She'll never let go, I said. She doesn't have a choice anymore. When the cars pulled away, the house felt like it was breathing again. The storm was fading, the wind calming to a whisper. Daniel sat on the couch, his hands shaking slightly. I thought she might. He stopped, unable to finish. She's gone, I said softly. It's done. He looked at me, his voice breaking. You saved my life, Mom. I shook my head. No. You saved yourself by finally seeing the truth. He leaned back, eyes closing. The exhaustion on his face was heavy but peaceful. Rachel lingered by the door. The court date's next week. You'll both need to testify, but after that, she's out of your life for good. After she left, I turned off the lights and sat beside my son. The clock ticked softly in the silence. Rainwater dripped from the eaves outside, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat returning to normal. I hate that I still miss her, Daniel said, suddenly voice raw. You loved her, I said. Love doesn't vanish just because the person who gave it turned out cruel. It just changes shape. It becomes a scar instead of a wound. He nodded, eyes distant. Do you think she'll ever be sorry? Maybe, I said. But her regret won't heal you. Only time will. The storm outside began to fade into mist, leaving the city washed clean. For the first time, the house didn't feel haunted anymore. It was just a home again, quiet, fragile, alive. Later that night, as I closed the curtains, I saw Daniel asleep on the couch, his chest rising and falling steadily. I looked around the living room, no shadows, no lies, no trace of her scent in the air, just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the steady rhythm of rain. I whispered to myself, she can't hurt us anymore. But somewhere deep down I knew that the echo of Lydia's voice would linger, not as a threat, but as a reminder. A reminder that evil rarely comes with fangs or fury. Sometimes it comes wearing a smile, calling you Mom. The courthouse smelled of rain and old paper. I sat at the long wooden table beside Daniel, our hands resting inches apart, neither of us speaking. Across the room, under the harsh fluorescent lights, Lydia sat between her two attorneys, her wrists free now, but her posture rigid. She wore a simple gray suit instead of the orange jumpsuit, her hair neatly brushed, her face pale. For a moment, she looked like the woman I used to know, the one who'd once called me Mom. But the mask cracked the moment she looked up and met my eyes. There was no warmth there, only calculation. Detective Rachel Brooks entered quietly and handed a folder to the prosecutor, nodding in our direction. The hum of the ceiling fans filled the silence. The judge's gavel hit once. Case number 512-47. The State of California versus Lydia Grace Ellis. Charges include attempted murder, fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Lydia didn't flinch. Her lawyer stood all confidence. Your Honor, my client maintains that she was misled by misinformation and emotional distress. She deeply regrets her actions but denies intent to harm. Rachel exchanged a look with me. I could almost hear her thoughts. Here comes the performance. The prosecutor rose. The evidence will speak for itself. Then the screen at the front of the courtroom flickered on and the first video played. The sound of boiling soup filled the speakers, followed by the soft scrape of a spoon. Lydia appeared on screen, standing in the kitchen, her face blank as she poured white powder into the pot. The courtroom went still. That powder, the prosecutor said, was confirmed by toxicology reports to be arsenic. Lydia's jaw tightened, but she didn't look away. The next clip showed her wiping the counter clean, whispering to herself, "If she really changes that will, I can't wait another month." The words echoed through the room. Somewhere in the back, someone gasped. Daniel's hands clenched on the table. "Would you like to explain this recording, Mrs. Ellis?" the prosecutor asked. Lydia leaned forward. "It was frustration," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You can't prove what I meant. I wasn't planning anything. I was angry." The prosecutor nodded slowly. "Let's look at another exhibit." An audio file played next, captured during her call to an associate. Lydia's voice came through sharp and cold. "Make sure the transfer happens before she finds out. He's already signed it. Once she's gone, it's all mine." Daniel flinched as if struck. The prosecutor turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, these aren't the words of a confused woman. They're the words of someone orchestrating a slow, deliberate plan to remove obstacles her husband and her mother-in-law." For the first time, Lydia's calm broke. "You think I wanted to kill him," she snapped. "He was my life. Everything I did for him." Daniel's voice broke the silence. "You poisoned me," he said. "You watched me get sick day after day, and you still smiled at me." She turned to him, eyes wide. "No, you don't understand," he stood abruptly. "I understand perfectly." His voice was louder now, full of the pain he'd kept buried. "You wanted control. You wanted the company, the money, my mother's name. You never wanted me." The bailiff stepped forward, but Daniel sat down again, shaking. "I reached for his hand and he let me hold it this time." The prosecutor continued. "Your Honor, the defendant falsified signatures, created an offshore account under the name Ellis Grace Foundation, and transferred over $400,000 before she was caught. When confronted, she increased the poison dosage. That is not impulse, that is intent." Lydia's lawyer stood again. "Your Honor, my client was under psychological pressure. She was isolated, manipulated." By whom? The prosecutor interrupted. "Her own greed." The judge rapped the gavel once. "Enough, proceed." The next witness was Dr. Stephen Ortiz. He took the stand with quiet professionalism, setting down a folder thick with reports. The samples provided by Mrs. Ellis were confirmed to contain arsenic trioxide. Chronic exposure at that level would cause fatigue, nausea, liver damage, and ultimately cardiac arrest. Mr. Daniel Ellis's blood work showed clear signs of accumulation consistent with several months of ingestion. Would he have survived without intervention? The prosecutor asked. Dr. Ortiz looked toward me briefly, then back at the judge. No. Another few weeks and he wouldn't be here. A hush fell over the room. I heard Lydia's breath hitch. Her hand trembled as she reached for a tissue, dabbing at eyes that stayed dry. The prosecutor turned to her again. Do you deny this evidence? She hesitated, then looked at me. I just wanted to secure our future. You were taking everything away from us. You mean everything you stole? I said softly. The judge cleared his throat. Mrs. Ellis, please answer the question. Her shoulders sagged. No, she whispered. I don't deny it. Gasps filled the courtroom. Daniel lowered his head into his hands. The prosecutor nodded. No further questions. After the recess, the judge called me to the stand. I hadn't planned on crying, but as soon as I raised my right hand, the weight of everything we'd survived hit me. I welcomed Lydia into our home like a daughter, I said. I believed in her. She was kind, polite, and I thought she loved my son. But love doesn't destroy. Love doesn't hide poison in soup and call it care. I lost my husband years ago, and I nearly lost my son because I trusted the wrong person. I paused, looking at Lydia. She wouldn't meet my eyes. I don't want revenge, I said. I want peace. I want her to face what she did, and never have the chance to hurt anyone else. The courtroom was silent, except for the clicking of a reporter's camera. The judge nodded gently. Thank you, Mrs. Ellis. When I stepped down, Daniel stood and walked past Lydia without a glance. The jury returned in less than 2 hours. We, the jury, find the defendant, Lydia Grace Ellis, guilty on all counts. The words hung in the air like a final bell. Lydia's head dropped. Her attorney leaned in to whisper, but she didn't respond. The judge's voice was steady. The sentence is 22 years in federal prison. The defendant is remanded into custody immediately. As the bailiff approached, Lydia looked up, eyes brimming with tears at last. "Daniel," she whispered, "I'm sorry." He turned toward her, face pale and unreadable. "No, Lydia, you're sorry you got caught." They led her away, the sound of her footsteps fading down the corridor. When the door closed behind her, the tension in my chest finally broke. I felt Daniel's hand slip into mine. Outside the courthouse, the sky was clear. The storm had passed, leaving the city washed and bright. Reporters shouted questions, but Rachel shielded us with her coat as we hurried to the car. "You both did well," she said. "It's over now." I looked back at the courthouse steps, at the doors where Lydia had disappeared. For years I'd thought of justice as something loud, a bang, a verdict, a headline. But standing there, I realized it was quiet. Justice wasn't fireworks. It was breathing without fear. That night, I stood on the balcony watching the sun sink behind the bay. Daniel joined me, a blanket draped over his shoulders. "She's really gone," he said softly. "Yes," I said, "and so is her shadow." He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think I can finally start over." The air smelled like salt and jasmine, the way it used to before everything fell apart. I closed my eyes, letting the sound of the waves wash through me. The past had finally settled, and what remained was silence, not empty, but clean. For the first time, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like someone who had stood in the storm and outlasted it. The morning of the sentencing was sharp and cloudless, the kind of morning that didn't seem to belong to tragedy. The courthouse steps were wet from the night's rain, glinting in the sunlight like clean glass. I stood there for a moment with Daniel, breathing in the chill air, feeling both lighter and heavier than I'd ever felt. Around us, the city moved on, as if nothing monumental was happening. People hurried to work, cabs honked, pigeons fluttered at our feet. Life, relentless and indifferent, kept going. Inside the courthouse, everything smelled of varnish and cold air. Reporters were waiting near the entrance, murmuring to one another. "There they are," someone whispered as flashbulbs went off. I put a hand on Daniel's arm. "Ignore them," I said. He nodded, his jaw set. He was pale but steady, dressed in a dark suit that made him look older, sterner, like the man he might have been if Lydia had never entered his life. When we walked into the courtroom, Lydia was already there, seated beside her public defender. Her hair had lost its shine. Her face was bare, no makeup, just exhaustion. She didn't look up as we sat down, but I could feel her eyes flicker toward us once. The judge entered and everyone rose. The courtroom fell into that heavy hush that feels almost sacred. The sound of the gavel broke it. "This court reconvenes for sentencing in the matter of the state versus Lydia Grace Ellis," the judge said. The prosecutor stood calm and resolute. "Your Honor, the state requests the maximum penalty allowable for attempted murder and fraud. The defendant's actions were deliberate, calculated, and devoid of remorse. Her victim was her husband. Her secondary target, her mother-in-law. She poisoned trust itself." Lydia's attorney rose next, his voice soft, tired. "My client acknowledges her wrongdoing. She has cooperated with the investigation and accepts responsibility. We ask for leniency." The judge looked down at Lydia. "Do you wish to address the court before sentencing?" She hesitated, then stood. Her voice was low, hoarse. "I don't know what to say that matters now. I thought I could fix my life by controlling it. I thought love meant ownership. I thought if I built something perfect, people would stay." Her gaze lifted, meeting Daniel's. "I did love you," she said. "In my own way. But I didn't know how to stop needing more." Daniel didn't move, didn't speak. His face was stone. Lydia turned to me then. "You got what you wanted, Margaret," she said, her tone breaking. "You always win." I looked at her evenly. "No one wins here," I said. "We all lost something." The judge cleared his throat. "Mrs. Ellis, your words may serve your conscience, but not the law. You had choices, and you made them." He glanced down at his notes. "This court sentences you to 22 years in the California Department of Corrections for attempted murder, fraud, and forgery, with no possibility of parole for the first 15. The words fell like a hammer, final and echoing. Lydia's shoulders sagged. A sound escaped her, not quite a sob, not quite a sigh, something hollow like the air leaving a broken vessel. As the bailiff approached, she turned to Daniel again. "Danny," she whispered, "don't let her turn you against love." He shook his head slowly. "You did that yourself." The bailiff took her arm and she didn't resist. She walked out quietly without looking back. The courtroom stayed silent until the door closed behind her. Outside, the sun was brighter than before. Daniel and I stepped into it blinking. The crowd of reporters was still there, but this time their questions sounded distant, irrelevant. Rachel met us at the steps. "It's done," she said simply. "Is it ever really done?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "It's as done as justice gets." Daniel didn't say anything. He stood staring at the courthouse doors, then turned away. "Let's go home," he said. The drive back was quiet. The bay shimmered in the distance, calm after the storm. When we pulled into the driveway, the house looked different, smaller maybe, or maybe just finally honest without her presence in it. Inside, the air smelled of lavender and coffee, not bleach or perfume. Daniel walked to the living room window, staring out at the garden. "I keep thinking about all the nights I ate what she made," he said quietly. "All the times I said thank you." "She was counting on your gratitude," I said. "That's how manipulation works. It wears a smile and waits for you to look away." He turned to me, eyes shining. "You saved me." I shook my head. "No. I did what mothers do. I fought for you. But you're the one who survived." We sat in silence for a while, watching the light move across the floor. The house creaked gently, alive again. The next morning we met with Harold at his office. He handed Daniel a folder. "The assets have been fully recovered," he said. "The foundation's been dissolved. And Lydia's share of the trust is being redirected to a charity for victims of domestic and financial abuse as per your mother's request." Daniel looked at me in surprise. "You really want to do that?" "Yes," I said. "Money built on lies should be turned into something that saves." Harold smiled faintly. I couldn't agree more. That afternoon I went back to my workshop for the first time in months. The familiar scent of sandalwood and rose filled the air. I mixed oils not for sale but for something personal. A new fragrance, one that smelled clean, sharp, alive. I named it Resilience. When Daniel came in, I handed him a small vial. "For you," I said. He opened it, inhaled, and smiled softly. "It smells like peace." "That's what it's made of," I said. That evening we sat on the patio watching the sun sink behind the bay. The sky was painted gold and crimson, the air cool and steady. Daniel turned to me. "Do you ever think about forgiving her?" I thought for a long moment. "Forgiveness isn't for her," I said. "It's for us, and maybe one day I'll be ready. But not yet." He nodded. "That's fair." A quiet settled between us, comfortable, almost sacred. For the first time, I felt that life was beginning again, not just continuing out of habit. Later, when Daniel went inside, I stayed out under the stars. The city lights shimmered faintly in the distance, and I thought about everything that had happened, the lies, the fear, the pain, and the strange clarity that came after. Justice hadn't brought happiness, it had brought space, room to breathe, to grieve, to heal. I whispered into the night, "We survived, Robert." Saying my husband's name out loud felt like closure. Somewhere I hoped he could hear it. When I finally went inside, Daniel had fallen asleep on the couch. I draped a blanket over him, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. The nightmare was over. The house felt like home again. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of the sea through the open window, cool and clean. It smelled like beginnings. A year has passed since that day in court, and San Francisco has changed its colors again. The fog rolls in softer now, the morning smell of sea salt and new beginnings. My garden has grown wild and fragrant, lavender, rosemary, and white jasmine climbing the fence. Every morning I step outside with my coffee and breathe it all in, the scent of things that survived. For a long time I thought survival meant just staying alive. Now I know it means learning to live again. Daniel moved back into his apartment downtown, not far from the waterfront. He's rebuilding piece by piece both his health and his life. He's thinner, quieter, but stronger in ways I didn't expect. He joined therapy, started mentoring young analysts at his firm, and last month, he told me he'd started dating again. Her name is Rachel, no relation to the detective, and when I met her, I saw the difference instantly. Her laugh was real. Her eyes didn't calculate every word. When she took Daniel's hand, it wasn't possession, it was partnership. The first time I saw him smile with her, I realized just how long I'd been holding my breath. The perfume company has changed too. I turned the Ellis brand into something that mattered. Part of every sale now goes to the Ellis Foundation for Resilience, a charity for women escaping manipulative or abusive relationships. The irony isn't lost on me. My daughter-in-law's greed ended up funding the very people she would have looked down on. Sometimes justice works that way, it doesn't roar, it ripples. At the launch event last month, reporters asked me how I found the strength to start over. I told them the truth. Strength isn't something you find, it's what's left when everything else has been taken. The room went quiet. For once, the silence didn't hurt. Lydia's name still appears in the news sometimes. A few online tabloids follow her case, spinning stories about her rehabilitation journey in prison. I don't read them anymore. Daniel doesn't either. Once he told me, "Mom, I don't want to hate her. I just don't want her to own any more of my thoughts." I understood exactly what he meant. Hate is just another kind of tether, and we've both had enough of those. Every month, I still visit Dr. Ortiz for Daniel's follow-up checkups. He always greets me with the same quiet smile. "You two are my favorite miracle," he likes to say. The last time we met, he handed me a small box. Inside was a silver charm shaped like a heartbeat line. "You should keep this," he said. "You earned it." I wear it sometimes on a thin chain hidden under my blouse, a private reminder that even after poison, life goes on. This afternoon I walked through the office where the foundation team was preparing care packages for women moving into new apartments after leaving shelters. Boxes filled with essentials, soap, books, candles, small vials of perfume. The scent I designed for them was called Revival. It's clean and simple green tea, bergamot and a hint of rain. The first time I blended it, I thought of Lydia's kitchen, the bitter soup, the deceit. Then I thought of the day after the sunlight breaking through, and I knew that bitterness could turn into something pure if you survived long enough. Later that evening, Daniel came by for dinner. We sat on the porch watching the city lights blink on one by one. The air was cool, the kind of calm you can taste. He looked at me for a long time before speaking. "You know," he said, "sometimes I still dream about her. But when I wake up, it's not fear anymore. It's gratitude that it's over." "That's how healing feels," I told him. "Not forgetting, just remembering differently." He smiled faintly. "I used to think love made people blind. Now I think the wrong kind of love does. The right kind makes you see everything more clearly." I reached for his hand. "Then you've already healed more than you know." He nodded and looked out at the street below. "Do you ever miss the person you thought she was?" I thought about that for a moment. Sometimes, I admitted. Because the person I thought she was deserved my love. But the person she really was taught me what kind of love deserves to be guarded. We sat in silence after that, just listening to the soft hum of the city. It was the same view Lydia had once claimed would make her feel powerful. But to me, power doesn't look like control anymore. It looks like peace. As the evening grew darker, Daniel stood to leave. He kissed my forehead the way he used to when he was little. "Thank you for never giving up on me," he said. "I never will," I said. After he drove off, I stayed outside listening to the sound of the waves drifting in from the bay. The stars were faint, but they were there, always there, even behind the clouds. I closed my eyes and whispered a quiet prayer. Not for vengeance, not for closure. Just for gratitude. Gratitude that I had the chance to see my son alive, to breathe air that didn't taste like fear, to open my eyes each morning and know I'd made it through. Before going inside, I walked to my small studio at the back of the house. On the shelf sat the last perfume bottle I ever made with Lydia's help, back when she was still pretending to be good. I picked it up, uncapped it, and let the scent drift into the air. It was sweet, cloying, artificial. It reminded me of a smile that never reached the eyes. I set it down gently, then took a new bottle, Resilience, and sprayed once. The difference was like night and dawn. Tomorrow, the foundation will host its first annual benefit dinner. Survivors from across the state are coming. We'll raise funds for counseling, legal support, and housing. I'll give a short speech, nothing grand, just a few words I've rehearsed in my head. There is no shame in being broken. The shame is in staying silent. The voice you use to tell your story is the same one that can save someone else. That's what I've learned from all this, that pain only has power when it's hidden. Once it's spoken, it starts to heal. When I finally went upstairs that night, the house was quiet. The clock ticked softly, steady as a heartbeat. I stood at the window for a while, watching the streetlights flicker on the wet pavement. The reflection of the moon trembled in a puddle outside, and I thought about how fragile everything had once felt and how strong it had become again. I whispered into the stillness, "We're free now." And maybe somewhere beyond the walls that truth echoed back. If you've listened to my story all this way, thank you. Maybe you've known fear like mine, or loss or betrayal that hollowed you out. Maybe you've been the one holding everything together when it felt like the world was crumbling. If so, I want you to remember this: you can survive anything and you can rebuild from nothing. If this story has reached you, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I want to know how far these words travel, how many hearts they touch. Don't forget to like and subscribe so more people can find stories like this, stories of justice, of love, of survival, and of hope. Because no matter how dark it gets, there's always someone out there lighting a candle in the storm.